Now, it's time to hear our first session for Socialism Conference 2021. A keynote speech by Prof. Walden Bello. And to moderate this session, I welcome Comrade Rehana Mohidin. Rehana Mohidin is a long-term socialist and feminist activist. She has written several articles and programmatic documents on feminism and socialism. She is a scientist and author of the recently published book on women and the energy revolution in Asia. She is a National Council member of the Partido Langkas Masa and the head of the PLM International Committee. Over to you, Comrade Rehana.
Thank you very much for that, Fatin, and welcome everyone to this opening and keynote session of Socialism 2021. I'm also a steering committee member of the broad left social democratic coalition in the Philippines, Laban ng Masa. And it's with great pleasure that I would like to introduce the chairperson of Laban ng Masa, kasamang Walden Bello. Walden, thank you for taking time out from the election campaign to speak at this session. Walden is also the standard bearer for the vice presidency in the upcoming national elections in the Philippines in May 2022, standard bearer for Laban ng Masa and the Partido Lakas ng Masa. Walden is currently the International Adjunct Professor of Sociology at the State University of New York, the co-chairperson of the Bangkok-based Research and Advocacy Institute focused on the Global South, author and co-author of numerous books, 25 and counting, received the Right Livelihood Award, also known as the Alternative Nobel Prize in Stockholm in 2003, for his work on globalization, was named Outstanding Public Scholar by the International Studies Association in San Francisco, and is currently our comrade in arms, taking on the Duterte regime and the axis of evil, what he calls the axis of evil, the alliance between Duterte and the Marcos dynasty to make a comeback through the 2022 elections. So with real pleasure, I'd welcome Walden Bello.
Okay, thank you very much, Comrade Rehana. And I would like to thank everyone in this regional and global conference on the challenges to socialism in our time. What I would like to do is to give you a speech that would hopefully be projected on the screen. If I can be made a co-host by the technician, then I will try to see if we can get the speech out on the screen and then we can move on. Can I be made a co-host?
Yes, you have been made a co-host.
Okay. Okay. Just a second, please.
Yes, we can
sorry.
see that.
No, that's not it. Sorry.
Okay.
I'm sorry about that. Okay. Can people see that then?
We can see some what's called the very real danger of war. Is
Okay,
that the
that's
one?
it.
The
Yes.
notes, yeah.
Okay.
Yep, we can see that.
Let me just check. Okay. So my the title of my talk today is the very real danger of war in the current conjuncture. Comrades, the last decade has seen the acceleration of the demise of the post-World War II dispensation, which was marked by the United States providing hegemonic leadership for global capital accumulation over a period of over 75 years. The key feature of the last decade has been the acceleration of multiple crises of global capitalism. Among these are the stagnation of the financialized economies of the West, the widening of the so-called development gap between the global North and most of the global South, the sharp increase in inequality between and within countries, the climate Armageddon, the rise of the fascist challenge to liberal democracies, and the deepening rivalry between the United States and China. All these crises stem from the inexorable search for greater and greater surplus value that is at the heart of capitalism. Perhaps the best example of the bankruptcy of capitalism in our era is the way the big capitalist powers are stubbornly blocking the waiver on the trade-related intellectual property rights at the World Trade Organization, a waiver that would allow countries of the Global South to manufacture vaccines and other COVID-19 related medicines. Despite the massive impact that the pandemic has had and continues to have on our societies, the emergence of a super COVID-19 strain that has been detected just in the last few days in Southern Africa underlies how much precious time has been wasted and how so many precious lives, are being threatened by the nefarious blocking tactics of big pharma that have been supported by the big capitalist powers. Now, in a recent piece that was carried in Socialist Register 2022 at the Summit of Global Capitalism, Accommodation, Rivalry, or Confrontation between the US and China, I dealt with different aspects of the competition between the two great capitalist powers of the world today. I will not engage in the theoretical discussion of whether or not China is a capitalist power. I will just assume that it is a capitalist power, given the unavoidable fact, that the economy of the country is really being run on capitalist lines, largely at this point. At the beginning of the third decade of the 21st century, China was not only the world's second biggest economy, it had become the center of global capital accumulation, or in the popular image, the locomotive of the world economy, accounting for 28% of all growth worldwide in the 5 years from 2013 to 2018, more than twice the share of the United States, according to the International Monetary Fund. True, China's growth was down to 6% from the blistering 10 to 12% rates in the 2000s, but that was far superior to the performance of the US economy that had been, for all intents and purposes, in the grip of stagnation for almost a decade following the 2008 Wall Street crisis. In 2020, China's economic recovery from the impact of the coronavirus pandemic earlier in the year made it the only major economy to register a positive growth rate. What I would like to do here is to focus on the military aspects of the relationship, since it is here that I feel the most danger lies. If there is one area where the United States still enjoys an overwhelming advantage over China, it is on the strategic front. In his speech at the 19th National Congress of the Communist Party of China on October 18, 2017, the famous Chinese Dream speech, President Xi Jinping laid out a three-stage schedule for China's military modernization, ending at mid-century with the achievement of the military of being of world-class forces, quote unquote, that, quote, could manage and deter and win wars, unquote. One can read that assertion as his admission that the People's Liberation Army was some 30 years behind the US military, which is universally regarded as the world-class standard. Since the 1990s, the Pentagon has sounded warnings that China was set to become the US's strategic rival. His concerns were, however, placed secondary to the priority of Washington's political and business elites to integrate China into the global economy. With Trump's accession to power in 2016, however, China was defined not only as a competitor, but as an antagonistic competitor. As the landmark 2017 National Security Strategy paper put it, and I quote, "For decades, US policy was rooted in the belief that support for China's rise and for its integration into the post-war international order would liberalize China. Contrary to our hopes, China expanded its power at the expense of the sovereignty of others. China gathers and exploits data on an unrivaled scale and spreads features of its authoritarian system, including corruption and the use of surveillance. It is building the most capable and well-funded military in the world after our own. Its nuclear arsenal is growing and diversifying. Part of China's military modernization and economic expansion is due to its access to the US innovation economy, including America's world-class universities." So this was what became the Trump administration's definition of China as a strategic rival. As the US's civilian elites engage in what has become unrestricted political warfare, making even a modicum of consensus impossible in most areas, there is one goal where both liberal and conservative elites coincide, indeed compete to proclaim their adherence to, and that is to maintain the overwhelming edge of the US state. Also, it is not impossible that as the civilian elites exhaust themselves in fratricidal strife, the military will take a more and more active role in defining the country's overall direction. But we would like to ask, how really do the United States and China's armed forces compare today? In 2019, US military expenditures were about 3 times more than China's, $732 billion to $261 billion. The rise in military spending by the US was 5.3% from its level in 2018, while that of China was 5.1%. So US military spending by far outstripped that of China. US officials now routinely describe China as a quote unquote near peer competitor. Now, this is grossly inaccurate if we use non-partisan indicators. First of all, in terms of nuclear weapons, Beijing has a relatively small nuclear force that is guided by a no first use doctrine focused on deterring a potential aggressor via the maintenance of a second strike retaliatory capability. The United States has vastly superior nuclear capabilities, and it has not adopted a no first use position. China has only about 260 nuclear warheads, while at the end of 2017, the US's nuclear arsenal contained approximately just under 1,000 1,400 deployed and approximately 4,000 stockpiled warheads. Second, China's conventional offensive capabilities are grossly inferior to that of the United States. Two key indicators of a country's offensive capability are its overseas bases and its aircraft carriers. China has only one overseas military base, and that is located in Djibouti, off the Gulf of Aden, from which it participates in anti-piracy activities. The US has scores of military bases surrounding China, 25 major bases and 60 other facilities spread all over Japan, 15 bases in South Korea, 3 bases in Guam, and 5 bases in the Philippines. In terms of aircraft carriers, China has 2 operational carriers with an antiquated Soviet-era design, while the United States has 11 carrier task forces, one of them the 7th Fleet, based in Yokosuka, Japan, which can easily be supplemented by another carrier task force from the Eastern Pacific in the event of conflict. US carriers, like the recently commissioned USS Gerald Ford, are the state of the art, far in advance of anything China has to offer. Even the Pentagon does not dispute Beijing's strategic posture as strategic defense, which, to quote the Pentagon, is rooted in a commitment not to initiate armed conflict, but to respond robustly if an adversary challenges China's national unity, territorial sovereignty, or interests. The US strategic posture, on the other hand, is offensive. It has 3 key components. One is forward deployment, that is to push the presence of US military power as far as possible from the territorial limits of the United States and as near as possible to the borders of a likely enemy. Second is a war-fighting strategy called Air-Sea Doctrine. A key document explicitly points to China as the enemy, and it calls for, quote, kinetic and non-kinetic, in other words, both explosive and electronic strikes against inland command centers, radar systems, and intelligence gathering facilities, raids against missile production and storage operations, and blinding operations against Chinese satellites. It also says that China's, quote, seaborne trade flows would be cut off with an eye towards exerting major stress on the Chinese economy and eventually internal stress, unquote. Third, the United States' long-term strategic perspective is overmatch. According to noted defense analyst Mike Clare, and I quote, although reminiscent of containment in some respects, overmatch differs from Cold War strategy, not only because it presumes 2 and possibly more major competitors instead of just one, but also because it requires a perpetual struggle for dominance in every realm, including in trade, energy, and technology, unquote. China's strategic dilemma is that large parts of the US military forces in the Western Pacific lie right on its doorstep, entrenched in bases on the so-called First Island chain, or at sea in the forward deployed US 7th Fleet. Most of China's industrial infrastructure and population are located in the country's southeastern and eastern coasts, and thus are very vulnerable to US power in the event of conflict. Now, China's response to this dilemma has been to push its defenses outwards, placing anti-access, anti-denial weapons, A2AD, in maritime formations it seized in the South China Sea from countries like the Philippines. These moves have been justified unilaterally by saying that 90% of the South China Sea belong to China. China's claim to 90% of the South China Sea is illegal and violates the rights of 5 other countries that border that body of water. But From a strategic point of view, Beijing believes it is not the only option. It is the only option. It is not, of course, the only option, for China could work with the countries of ASEAN to create a demilitarized, denuclearized zone of peace instead of moving unilaterally and in a fashion that simply alienates the peoples of Southeast Asia. Be that as it may, US-China jockeying for power in the South China Sea is creating a very explosive situation, since there are no rules of the game except an informal balance of power, and resorting to balance of power as a regulator of conflict is quite unreliable, as was seen in the case of the European balance of power that resulted in the First World War. Right now, US and Chinese ships are engaged in provocative games of chicken, in which jet fighters buzz enemy ships and quote unquote, or warships, enemy planes or warships head for their rivals, then swerve at the last minute. When I visited Vietnam back in 2014, when I was a member of the House of Representatives Committee on National Defense, Madam Bin and others, and people know who Madam Bin was, were very worried about the fact, that a mere ship collision in that area could escalate into more than just, a ship collision, into a higher form of conflict. And the reason for this, and they were right to stress this, is that there are no rules of the game. The United States has, in fact, discouraged, for a long, long time, the creation of, a multilateral system, that would, in fact, have rules that would move conflict away, from war to diplomacy. And unfortunately, in recent times, when it comes to the South China Sea, or what we call the West Philippine Sea, China has also discouraged the creation of, a common set of rules to be able to deal with conflicts in that area, despite the fact that in 2002, it agreed, that, it would cooperate with ASEAN to create, what was called a code of conduct for ships and other seagoing vessels, and rules, for managing conflicts or managing disputes in the South China Sea. Now, Clausewitz famously wrote that, quote, "War is the extension of politics by other means," unquote. Now, this gives too much rational weight to rational calculus as the process of determining when to go to war. It grossly underestimates the role of passion. But what is truly dangerous is when passion is joined to rational calculus, such as when the desire to maintain hegemony is attached to a calculable process of when to go to war. Now, Xi Jinping's estimate at the 19th Party Congress that it will be in mid-century that China will have world-class forces that can match those of the United States has perhaps unwittingly given the Pentagon a sense that it has at most a 30-year window of opportunity, and most likely less, to do something. Will the Pentagon really allow Beijing to achieve strategic equality, which may well be the last step towards America's loss of global hegemony? Graham Allison, the Dean of the Security Studies Establishment, in the United States says that China and the US are, quote, on a collision course for war, unless both parties take difficult and painful actions to avert it, unquote. To many, a preemptive move on the part of the United States, given its bellicose history, is a very real possibility. Now, let me just remind all of us that for the last 250 years, the United States, has in fact been the most warlike society on earth, constantly engaged in wars of expansion and the maintenance of its hegemony. Let us just remind ourselves here that the United States was at war in the Middle East for 20 years, from 2001 to 2021. Of course, we all know that this warlike engagement in the Middle East ended, in defeat, in Afghanistan, in around earlier this year. Now, what I would just like to say is, that if you add to this the state of undeclared civil war in the United States between the forces of white supremacy and their opponents, well, this would contribute to distrust, for preemptive moves, because the only thing that the two sides in the US informal civil war can agree on is to militantly confront China. So the possibility, therefore, of regulating or letting off steam on the domestic front by uniting against an external enemy is something, that US elites at this point, that would be very tempting to US elites at this point in time. Because as we all know, in history, ways that domestic conflicts have often been avoided is to channel all those warlike energies into an external enemy. So let me end by asking the question, is war between China and the US inevitable? Nothing is inevitable. But unless the forces for peace in global civil society intervene in this conflict, the passage from rivalry to war may gather speed. Let me end with this challenge to all of us. I thank you again for giving me the opportunity to engage you comrades today.
Thank you very much, Walden, for that compelling analysis that one of the most dangerous implications of the multiple crisis of the capitalist system that we face today is on the military front, given the unmatched strategic advantage that the United States has here, and especially in relation to the emerging global power, China, and also pointing out the implications for our region with the South China Sea as a very real potential, not even potential, but as a very real flashpoint with major implications. I will now open it up to question and answers session. I've been told that you need to go into the Q&A and put your comments and so on there. There's a very long comment, but there's also, which I'll just leave for the moment and have a look at later, but there's also a question here from Saeed Balok. Does China compete does China compete, or can China compete with the US without support from ASEAN? I think that's the gist of the question. Walden, can you see the Q&A on your?
Yes.
Great. Okay. So the Saeed Balak question. And then there's a long comment. I'll just go through it while you concentrate on the question, perhaps.
Yes. Well, maybe the answer to that is the relations of China with ASEAN is quite complex at this point in time. On the other hand, there are countries in ASEAN, such as the Philippines, Malaysia, Indonesia, that Vietnam, that do not have very good relations with China at this point because of the conflicts in the South China Sea, which in the Philippines, part of which we call the West Philippine Sea. So there is, a sense that China is behaving like an old-fashioned imperial power. As I mentioned earlier, there is, China's strategic position of what it calls strategic defensive, in the view of the way that it is surrounded by US bases in several countries, and the fact that the United States Seventh Fleet dominates the South China Sea, has tried to push its defenses outwards, and part of that has been taking over maritime formations that belong to the Philippines, not belong, but are in the Philippines exclusive economic zone. And at the same time, claiming that China owns the whole 90% of the South China Sea. So in effect, what it regards the South China Sea as an inland body of water, the same way. So the problem is, so we have problems, with that position on the part of China. I mean, we meaning, many of the countries of ASEAN have problems with that position of China. As I said, the only way really that we can meet the demands of justice, national sovereignty, regional cooperation, and at the same time, secure China's strategic defense concerns, is really a cooperative one of promoting a demilitarized and denuclearized zone from which we would exclude third parties like the United States. Okay. Now, of course, that will mean a lot of negotiation, but it is a process that would be far more solid and far more friendly, less antagonistic, and eventually lead to much more solid cooperation, between the ASEAN countries and China. Unfortunately, instead, China has taken a shortcut to meet its strategic needs, and this has been to declare the so-called 9-dash line, that 90% of the South China Sea belongs to it, and other countries bordering the South China Sea are in fact interlopers, and so that's a reproduction of big power politics. It's behaving like an imperial power in this regard, and I think that is not, a really good behavior, for the rest of the peoples, especially in Southeast Asia. Now, I said complex because at the same time, there are countries in ASEAN like Cambodia and Laos that are very close to China, and in fact are marked by the heavy presence of Chinese investment, meaning investment from China, not just overseas Chinese. Okay. and whose diplomatic positions tends to conciliate and support China. So that with respect to ASEAN, with respect to China, ASEAN is effectively split. Okay. Now, in the recent past, President Duterte in the Philippines moved, the Philippines from a position of, strong support for the United States and a very strong alliance with the United States. And he was moving to a position of more and more friendly relations with China. And part of that was in order to be able to secure Chinese funds and Chinese investments for the Philippines. However, when it came to the United States, even though rhetorically he was expressing a number of anti-US remarks, finally he threatened to withdraw from the visiting forces agreement. He backed down. First of all, he during the siege of Marawi that many of you are familiar with in 2017, he allowed US special forces to help secure Marawi from the insurgent forces. And secondly, he backed down. He said, that no, the visiting force agreement with the United States, we are reaffirming it. Okay, so this has resulted in the worst of all worlds for the Philippines, in that we have a government that is now under the thumb of both China and the United States. Okay, so this is the particular situation where the Philippines finds itself at this point in time. So that's briefly the state of relations between ASEAN and China.
Thanks, Walden. Now, there are other questions that I think you have addressed already, bits in your response there. How can we stop imperialist wars, and is China more on a defensive posture? I think you've already addressed those. In terms of the prevention of imperialist wars, certainly in terms of the regional demilitarization and the negotiations of parties leaving out external parties, but you could perhaps elaborate on that, or shall we move on to some of the other questions?
Let me just say here that I said earlier, that when we look at the South China Sea, what we often hear are the encroachments of China on the rights of other countries in the region, particularly with Vietnam and the Philippines. But we do not often hear on the news the fact, that the US regards the South China Sea as an American lake and has always regarded it as an American lake. Okay. Indeed, the US 7th Fleet is the dominant power in the South China Sea. You have, and that's, the US just does what it wants in the area. Military and ships. It's not, it says that it's defending rights of passage, but in fact, it is defending. The US is promoting, the military rights of dominion that have long been exercised by the United States. So at any given day in the South China Sea, you have large numbers of US ships And in those areas that are the less shallow parts of the South China Sea and the ocean bordering it, you have US attack submarines and strategic submarines operating. So basically, as this has been long regarded as a special playground for the US military. And whenever there has been the threat of conflicts emerging in the area, the United States has sent not only aircraft carrier from Yokosuka from the 7th Fleet, but from the 3rd Fleet in the Eastern Pacific, as in 1996 when it sent 2 aircraft carriers to the Taiwan Straits. When there was this conflicts between China and Taiwan. So it was during the Clinton administration, this was a big move, to tell China to back off from threatening our ally. In recent years, the US has escalated this. Just in the last few months, it has pushed the Great Britain, the UK, to send I believe it's the Prince of Wales through the area. In fact, during the G7 meeting in Cornwall, right after that meeting, the British aircraft carrier, at the behest of the US and with US Army naval personnel on board, steamed towards the South China Sea. And there were also French vessels, under, again, the guise of NATO partnership that went to the area. And of course, the last thing that emerged with respect to this was the US and Australia agreeing to a deal whereby the United States would provide nuclear-powered submarines via the UK, nuclear-powered technology via the UK to Australia in order to be able to confront China in the Pacific. Initially, the deal was between Australia and the French, but the US pressured Australia to renege on that contract and instead engage in buying US nuclear-powered submarine technology. And this, of course, created a big problem between the Australian and the French government and Washington. So I guess what I'm trying to say here is that the US provocative moves are not reported on, while that of China, are reported on. I think that, of course, both countries are engaged in provocative moves, but there is a way by which, especially the Western and ASEAN media, often neglect to report, the real provocative measures, naval measures being engaged in by the United States. And of course, this creates a situation whereby China is seen as the aggressor, and so that's what we have here is a very, very, very dangerous situation, because as the Vietnamese said, here are vessels from rival countries now engage in games of chicken, they serve at the last minute. What if you, in fact, have a real collision that takes place, and there are no rules of engagement because both sides don't want rules of engagement? Then we have a real problem. And as Madame Bin and the Vietnamese said to me, this could really escalate into something that's more than just a ship collision. So this is why I think that probably the most dangerous spot in the world today is the South China Sea, because of the way, that you really have the naval armed power of two very powerful countries facing each other.
Okay, questions are coming in thick and fast, and there are also people raising their hands. So can we get a copy of your speech? Walden?
Yes.
Yeah, that'll
I
be great.
think I have given it to the organizers.
Okay, excellent.
Yes.
So that's Philip Wong. Yes, we've got it. The organizers will figure out how to get it to people who want a copy. There's a question here about cognitive warfare, US's capabilities on the cognitive warfare front. I guess that's intelligence. So do you want to take that next? Charlie Tan, Walden.
Well, I think what we often find now is, information technology. There are claims that, China is leading in terms of information technology when it comes to, warfare. But these are just claims. I've never really seen it proven. There are anecdotal examples that often come up, but even the Pentagon does not make the claims that China is now leading it or has an edge in terms of information technology. What you do see is there are a number of writers of, mainly defense writers, that basically say that if you do not get a closer cooperation between Google and Microsoft and the other big tech firms with the Pentagon, then China might be in the future able to outstrip the US in terms of warfare related to the development of information technology. So that's the kind of thing that you see that let us maintain what these people are saying is the only way that we can maintain our edge in terms of information technology, especially applications for warfare, is much closer cooperation between Silicon Valley and the Pentagon. So they're not satisfied with the degree of cooperation that is happening right now. They really want a much more integrated military industrial complex where basically you have a working cartel. So I would, those claims of China catching up in terms of cyber warfare, I would tend to take with a grain of salt, at this point in time, precisely because there's very little proof that that is the case.
I'll take one more question and then we'll go to the people who've got their hands raised. This is from Community Radio 3CR, Vivian Langford. That's a community radio station in Melbourne, Walden, very well known, great community service. Do you see China and the US finding a common cause in decarbonizing their economies in the name of climate action? Interesting question, I think.
Well, the I think we had a statement recently at a very general level about Beijing and Washington cooperating in terms of confronting the climate challenge. But and probably that was in reaction to China's not attending COP26 and Biden making much of that. The thing people remember from COP26 is President Biden sort of lecturing Xi Jinping that, hey, why aren't you here? Why aren't you here? The only way you can make a difference is you come here and yet you ignore it. So it was that kind of hectoring by the United States and China's non-presence that I think created the impetus. It wasn't good. The impression of both wasn't good. That some elements on both sides basically say this is not very good, that we're leaving this impression that we're competing with each other in a game of one-upmanship. So why don't we issue this common statement? A general statement of cooperation will not harm us. So I think it was more along that line that they had the recent statement saying that they would cooperate in terms of confronting the climate challenge. But in terms of actual cooperation, I don't think that's there. I think there is a game of one-upmanship that is going on, whereby the United States basically says we're back third year. We're going to take the lead in this whole thing, and then China coming back and saying, where were you over the last 4 years? You can't just come back. It's a different situation at this point in time. And besides, China is making these advances in terms of manufacturing, so advances in solar power, etc., etc. But you can't make us, we still have, we can't be made to hit the point whereby our carbon emissions come down until we hit, I believe it was 2060. Okay, I could be wrong. So basically, China's position, as far as I know, is their carbon emissions will come down at some point in the future, not just in the near future. And when it comes to the United States, there's a lot of rhetoric to catch up that they're going to deal with the climate issue, but the latest on that has been this $1 trillion infrastructure bill, which is supposed to incorporate green elements, but it's a lot of talks so far. And I think the response of civil society, that we've gone past talk and promises, and you've got to take concrete action. And COP26 is a failure precisely because you just made generalized statements of support and no concrete commitments of action have taken place. And I think it's now seen that COP26 was, in terms of its delivering anything, was a failure in contrast to the Paris conference or Paris Agreement. So that's where things are at. I mean, hopefully, China and the United States, and of course the others, can come around and see that it cannot just be rhetoric anymore. Something has to happen because the movement to plus 2 degrees centigrade plus beyond, global warming beyond 2 degrees centigrade, and even the possibilities of that going to 3 or to 4 by the end of the century is there at this point. It's not just a threat in the far future. We're talking about this escalating within the next decade or so. And so I think what came out, that I think global civil society at this point is saying, you can't fool us again. The big powers, especially the big carbon emitting powers, just, you can't get away with the old promises. You have to move now. And of course, China and the United States are the two key actors, in moving these things forward at this point in time.
All right, we can look at a couple of the participants who've raised their hands. Is Naveen? I've got Wilfredo Rojas, is that right? Hello? Okay, how do we do this? Do we, Wilfredo, hello, Wilfredo? Do you want to ask your question? Is that it? Is that the way to proceed? Naveen, yes? Yes, okay. Naveen has allowed Wilfredo to speak. I think he's unmuted you. Wilfredo Rojas, you want to ask your question? Are you still there? I think he's still muted. So let's go on because there are quite a lot of other questions here coming up. I've lost track here. There's a question here. What is the extent of right-wing US support for the Uyghur independence movement?
For the what independence movement?
I'm probably not pronouncing it properly. Uyghur independence movement, U-Y-G-H-U-R.
Oh, okay.
I pronounce it as Uyghur. It's probably not right. Yeah, Warden. U-Y-G-H-U-R.
Well, I'm not exactly sure whether there is actual military and paramilitary support that is taking place at this point. Although if you read Graham Allison's book, Destined for Conflict, one of the suggestions that he makes, or the scenarios that he raises, is in fact the US actively, supporting what he calls separatist movements, including the Uyghur movement in China. So this is one of the scenarios that he lays out. And it seems that this is Allison's preferred scenario, whereby not outright military conflict, but supporting insurgent movements in China. And of course, if you are in Beijing and you read that, since Allison is so close to the intelligence agency of the United States, you would say, yes, they're taking this seriously. In fact, they might even be moving at this point in time. So I would not take it beyond, I would say, I think we need to be vigilant in terms of that possibility that is in fact taking place. Now, I think what the US has done, though, is to try to make it a big issue. And indeed, this has been part of, what both the Republicans and the Democrats have done, is to try to take away the focus from the Black Lives Movement and, the repression of, especially of Black people, African Americans, and to say, oh yeah, let's, refocus on China's, what's happening in Xinjiang, on repression of the Uyghur movement. So this is sort of, derailing world attention from the crisis of the United States in terms of racial warfare, and then sort of deflecting that, and then putting the onus on China, basically weaponizing human rights, and now, of course, when it comes to China, I think that my own sense is that that there are problems with the way that it has dealt with its Uyghur minority. Maybe some of the accounts have been exaggerated, but nevertheless, it does seem like more independent accounts, do articulate, the reality that there is, an effort to integrate the Uyghurs in a way, that has elements of repression and oppression. Okay, so it is, a kind of my sense is a forcible integration, and which often includes the, bringing in, trying to tip the demographic balance in terms of the Han majority. So I don't think that we can just say that that's not happening, because my sense is that there is some of that happening. But the important thing is not to fall into either the United States weaponizing human rights, or to fall for Beijing's blanket, blanket denial that, that there are problems in the way that it's dealing with the Uyghur minority, and that it would be very important for it to rectify its approach. So I would say that it is very important for global civil society and us to take a more critical role with respect to the claims of both the governments of both superpowers.
There's another question which alludes to the point you started off with, and that is the character of China. Is China muddling through this process of becoming a neo-imperialist capitalist power? Do you want a little bit of a break, a couple of minutes, or you're quite happy to go through, Walden? We can make some announcements while you have a couple of sips of water.
It's up to you. It's up to you, Rayana. Either way is fine with me, but it's up to you.
Okay, just a quick announcement so Walden can have an extra sip of water. Yes, the documents will be shared post the event. We will document the sessions, and we will share the presentations that we get through a link post the event. Okay, so that's message there. Now, yes, so we've got this question here. OG, you've got a couple of questions regarding China and Cuba as well, but I'll come back to that a bit later. Yes, so Walden, is China muddling through this process of becoming a new imperialist capitalist power? Janath Apudurai.
Well, well, first of all, I think, you know, China is, China is, dominant in China at this point in time is a capitalist mode of production. I think if you look at it, for the most part, market relations govern the economy. And both domestic and foreign capitalist firms are very active in most areas of the economy. Although there is, 150,000 state enterprises, both national and provincial, and China's, makes sure that there are strategic areas of the economy that are controlled by the state, and that here foreign investors are subjected to fairly strong rules, and there is state support for state enterprises that are engaged in these strategic areas of the economy. And part of this is, of course, supporting the international reach and technology acquisition efforts of big Chinese enterprises. Okay, so my sense is, that this is, in a very rough way, the character of the Chinese economy at this point in time. It is what we would say a capitalist economy sui generis, of its own kind. Okay, and to try to fit it into to try to fit it into established categories about what kind of capitalist society it is, might lead us to be making a big mistake. Okay, certainly when Trump and Peter Navarro, his advisors basically say that when they said that their objective was to get China to be more of an economy like the United States, instead of being a state-led and state-directed economy, and that was the goal of their policy, not just trade war. That was an acknowledgement of the fact that, China is a very different capitalist economy from the United States, although it is capitalist. As to its relationship to the global South, I think that, of course, there are people that say at this point that China is an imperial power, but I don't think so. If you look at the way that it has expanded over the last 25 years, which has been the era of Chinese expansion, compared to the West, there has been, very little, grabbing of markets that have taken place. A lot of China's expansion abroad has been, peaceful and commercial expansion. And part of this, of course, has been the fact that China became a member of the World Trade Organization in 2001, and it has become the main beneficiary, the opening up of markets that has been pushed by mainly the Western powers, ironically has benefited mainly China. Okay, and of course there have been problems that have been created for other countries of the global south by the World Trade Organization. And I'm a strong critic of the World Trade Organization, but nevertheless, I think when you look at it, um, China's ability to be able to expand peacefully has been because of its membership in the World Trade Organization. So ironically, it has expanded mainly at the expense of countries like the United States and other of the industrial countries of the global north. But its relationships with countries of the global south in terms of accessing raw materials, investments, labor, yes, there have been some problems with respect to this, which cannot be denied. But at the same time, I don't think that the quality of the relationships have been like that of imperialism of the United States and Europe. There have been abuses, definitely, like for instance, bringing Chinese workers to Africa and just relying on them and not relying on the labor force. And of course, there has been the Belt and Road Initiative. Now, this is big effort, $4 trillion effort to be able to link infrastructurally China, Europe, and other countries. And many countries and governments have become part of that enthusiastically. But it has not been something that is an unalloyed good, because there are also people that would say that China is really a beneficent power that's out to make the world a better place. So there's that other thing that goes there to those people that say it's an imperial power. Now, part of the problem that we find, for instance, with the Belt and Road is that a lot of the projects are large-scale hydroelectric and carbon-intensive projects. And many civil society organizations in different countries, from like the Philippines, Indonesia, and others, have in fact brought these criticisms up that these development projects are developmentalist, top-down projects that are not good for the environment and really benefit only the elites. So I think some of those criticisms are really correct. Okay. Now, is China making an effort to correct some of this? Well, if I'm not mistaken, it really made a statement recently that there would be no longer any, that the Belt and Road Initiative would no longer involve promoting coal-fired power plants. If I'm not mistaken, that was a recent statement made about 3 or 4 weeks ago. And my question is, okay, that's great, but is it really taking place, or what are the plans so that this hydroelectric big dams or coal-fired power plants are phased out? Instead, you have projects in which people participate in the process of determining what projects are adopted and project design. So I think we've seen some indications that China is willing to rectify some parts of the Belt and Road Initiative, but it's got to be translated into action at this point in time. And at the same time, I think we need to acknowledge the fact that so many developing countries are basically comparing China, and Western aid, and say that, first of all, there's so little real Western aid at this point in time. China is the place to go, and China has less conditionalities in terms of the aid that it offers than the West. So it's not surprising that many developing countries are beginning to just bypass the World Bank and the IMF or bilateral aid and just going directly to China. But I think that sort of relationship between China and developing countries is also something that needs to be worked out much more fully for the advantage of people and civil society, because oftentimes the governments that China deals with, are, repressive governments and elite-dominated governments. So, so in that area, there's also some way to go to be able to have really beneficial relationships. But my sense is that it's just been 25 years since China really went out to the world. And it has been a learning process, errors, but at the same time, there have been efforts to learn. And I think that to then compare China to the bloody, oppressive, dirty history of Western imperialism, I don't think that's fair. I mean, that's not a historical way of going about it. I mean, we have criticism of China, but but I do not agree with the term that it is simply reproducing the Western model of imperialism. If all I can say is that my own position is that the best thing we can do for China is to be very critical of, when it deserves criticism, let's raise the criticism, so that it can learn from it. And that's why I think that, yes, the best way that, if we want to influence China's behavior, it is not to conciliate it, but when we see something wrong, let's point it out. And point it out that if you don't change what you're doing, you could end up just like the West and hated just like the West. So that's my view. That's why whenever we've written things about China, we've tried to be fair, but we've also brought out real problems, but in the spirit of getting it to rectify the way it is doing things, because that we feel is the best way, in fact, to influence it in another direction.
Okay, we've got two comrades who've raised their hands, so we'll have them on now. They've been waiting for a while. Victor, unmute
Yes,
ba.
yes.
Sige, Victor, ask your question. Go ahead.
Kawal din, is there a possibility that the US will be facing a civil war
If
the US will be on civil war?
A civil war inside the US, yeah.
Well, my view may be controversial on this, but there's already an informal civil war in the United States. I've just been there, and the polarization of the society between the white supremacists, which have now gained control of the Democratic Party, Republican Party, and the democratic forces is quite stark at this point in time. And so it's not civil war in the sense of, being armed and violent at this point in time, but it's a very polarized society where, I believe the latest statistics
I think it's frozen. Hello. Okay, we've got you back.
Okay. I've got to go in a few minutes because I've got a photo shoot for the campaign.
Sorry, I'm just putting on my hearing aid. I'm in my.
Oh, I've got to go in a few minutes because I have a photo shoot for the campaign.
Oh, all right. So I guess in which case we'll just have to wrap up now. Do you want to make any final comments, Walden, before you leave?
Oh, yes, I was discussing the, I think at the local, state, and national levels, the parliamentary institutions of the United States are being paralyzed at this point by the actual social conflict in which is being driven by, which is driven by the white supremacists, real effort to, to stop, the process of democratization, because of their feeling that democratization is just going to lead to a non-white majority in the United States. And I think, that is a very strong driving force in the US at this point. Of course, we can analyze that. Where did that come about? The contribution of neoliberalism to that, and all of this made a role. But I do not think, and the problem is this: once the formal institutions of democracy, get are frozen or stalemated, then that is when social polarization breaks out into the streets, and some of that is polarization that can then become armed polarization, and things get fought out on the streets. And that's why this recent decision by a jury in Wisconsin to acquit on all charges a white kid who went to a demonstration armed and with the intention to kill demonstrators for Black Lives Matter, and in fact killed two of them, and I guess he wounded one. I could be mistaken in my details here. And yet the jury acquitted him on all counts. I think this is now being seen as a further step in this informal civil war. It's a very, it's a very polarized society at this point in time, and the areas of consensus are breaking down all over. And that's why I said, that there's only one area where Democrats and Republicans, liberals and right-wingers unite, and that is against China. And that makes the danger of confrontation with China as a way by which they can channel domestic pressures outward. That makes, therefore, the rivalry with China something that is, very, very foreboding. We have a lot of foreboding on that, and makes it a bit quite dangerous, I would say. Thank you.
Walden, sorry, do you have to leave straight away, or is there room for one more question?
Sure, go ahead.
Great. Well, there's several questions that seem to be addressing this issue of what is the role of the socialist movement in being able to respond to the dangers that you have outlined, especially the possibility of war, and to prevent it, what is the role of the socialist movement in all this? And there are some historical references here to in the past where wars have created the conditions for revolution. Of course, the Chinese Revolution, the Russian Revolution, and so on. But of course, we know that wars are today, 21st century wars, are possibly a slightly different proposition to a 20th century war, given the military hardware that we've got, that imperialism has. Yes, so could you just perhaps finally wrap up with this this question of the role of the socialist movement and, broadly speaking, the working class movement in this?
Well, I think clearly we in the socialist movement should be working together with movements that have emerged in other areas, like on climate, on movements against the rise of authoritarianism, on movements to promote advance women's rights and LGBT rights. And so, all of these movements, they may not exactly, have the same sort of theoretical positions as each other, but nevertheless, when it comes to practical action, they are increasingly moving in the same direction of really enlarging, democratic space and towards participatory democracy. And the realization that it's only if we really push for the widest enjoyment of democratic rights that we will be able to counter the rise of the right, as well as may become a force for, a increasingly unified force to be able to influence, the global situation when it comes to peace and climate. So my sense is that there's a wide space for cooperation between movements that may have different starting points, but have a similar endpoint. And that is whether we call it, socialism or social democracy or participatory democracy. I think people are beginning to realize that that is the same endpoint. And to see that these movements, do contribute to enriching each other's traditions. What I would say is, these multiple threats, that are now racking the world are leading us, leading multiple movements to closer cooperation with one another. And I think, we are moving towards more practical cooperation, less doctrinaire conditions being set on this, precisely because of the urgency of the threats that we face. The threat to democracy by fascism, the threat of a climate Armageddon, and the threat of war between the United States and China. So so we are in an extremely fluid period, and of course nothing is given, nothing is determined, but the thing we must see is precisely that we need active intervention and active agency on our part to make sure that we have a soft landing instead of a crash in the next few years. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Walden Bello, for an excellent session, and a big virtual and real clap for your session. Thank you very much to all our participants. And we wish Walden farewell as he goes back into the throes of his election campaign, and wish him all
Yes.
the best in the campaign. Thank you very much,
Thank you.
Walden.
Thank you.
Very, truly appreciate it.
Yes. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Comrades, the next session, as I understand it, starts at 2 p.m. Is that right? 2 p.m. KL Manila time, 1 p.m. Bangkok Jakarta time, 5 p.m. Sydney Australia time. I haven't covered all the times. I noticed London and Italy and so on, but those are the times for the region here. And it's on building an equitable healthcare system for the 21st century. We've got Maria Fatima Jofti Villena, Dr. Chi Heng Leng, Wazi Gede, and moderator is Fahmi Panimbang from LIPS Indonesia. So that's at 2 p.m., a very important and interesting session as well. I'll leave it at that. Are there any announcements from Gandipan or anyone else on the technical stuff and the program?
No, I think that's all. We'll continue back at 2 p.m.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you to all our participants for such an excellent session. Bye-bye.